My name is Elina Troscenko, and I have the pleasure and honor of hosting and moderating this morning's conversation on Georgia's parliamentary elections and their implications for the future of this South Caucasus nation. So on Saturday, 26th of October, Georgians went to polls for elections that many describe as historic. Taking place in a highly polarized political landscape, these elections were framed by many as a choice between war and peace, and as a choice between Europe or Russia. This highlights the significant stakes of these elections for the country and its future. The ruling party, Georgian Dream, led by billionaire Bidzina Ivanishvili, has governed the country since 2012, so for the last 12 years, but has faced increasing criticism in recent years. Concerns about democratic backsliding, controversial foreign agent law, mass protests, and accusations of alignment with Russia have contributed to a highly polarized political landscape in the country, in which the opposition rallied around the promise of a European future. In this context, both the elections and their aftermath have been seen as a defining moment and a turning point for the country. The election results, as announced by the election authorities, gave Georgian Dream Party around 54% of the votes, and around 37% combined to the opposition parties. While the results are celebrated by some, the opposition, along with the country's president, are disputing the results. The election race was predicted to be close, as pre-election polls gave no clear winners. However, a lot of concerns have been raised about the fairness of these elections, as local and international observers have reported widespread election irregularities. Voter intimidation, pressure on the voters, voting on behalf of the others are just some of the things highlighted by observers. Moreover, state institution involvement in such irregularities and their lack of response to them suggests that ruling party has captured the state and uses it for its own benefits. As some people claim, these elections were stolen from us. The president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili, along with the leaders of oppositional parties, have stated that she does not recognize the results of the elections and called for street protests and demonstrations. So last night, thousands of people gathered in front of Georgia's parliament to protest against the election proceedings and to once again mark their wish for Georgia's pro-European future. So what does this all mean? What exactly happened on the election day? What are the realities on the ground? What has happened with the democratic institutions in Georgia, and where can we expect the country to move in the future? To explore these and other questions regarding Georgian political landscape, we have a great lineup of experts, including election observers, scholars working on the regions, and also a scholar from Georgia. Thank you all for joining us today. And before we start to discuss the aftermath and impact of the elections, let's start with the elections themselves. As I mentioned, the election results have been disputed, and we have heard reports about a range of irregularities that happened on the election day. And we have with us today Njål Eirik Ole Michaelsen, who has just returned from Georgia. Were you with the EDDA, European Dialogue and Democracy Association, where you observed elections along with other students from Norway. So, Njål, how did you experience these days in Tbilisi? How was the election day itself? And can you share some insights or preliminary findings from your observations? And how would you also maybe comment things that other observers have already reported that we see coming in?
I can start off with explaining a bit about EDDA. We're primarily a student organization based in Bergen and Oslo. This election, we were 30 young people from Norway that's observed the elections. It was our biggest delegation yet. And during the days, we met with multiple stakeholders and organizations there to get the full picture. And then we also observed all of the 10 electoral districts in Tbilisi. Our experience is it was a great trip. The stakeholders gave us a lot of insight. The election day was also successful, but we did have a lot of we witnessed a lot of irregularities. The overall picture was that the procedures were followed. However, there were concerns about voter intimidation that we witnessed. There was also violence present at some of the polling stations that we also experienced firsthand through our observers. And there are also cameras that were present in the election polls that we learned that were not really a part of the official procedure, but rather a tool that the Georgian Dream Party was allowed to have in the polling stations, which also raised some questions from our side. But overall, in the vast majority of the polling stations that we attended, the procedures were followed. However, every polling station was also very crowded, both with election workers and with partisan observers mostly, which also made the polling stations have a lot of tension, and also it was quite chaotic. There were also some concerns regarding identification of voters. We were warned from several organizations before the elections that people had gotten their IDs taken away arbitrarily, and that these were used to perform carousel voting, as it's called, or multiple voting, people voting multiple times. And so we are not completely sure that this was hindered by the procedure of the elections. Overall, the atmosphere in Tbilisi was quite calm, but we also talking to people, people were very, very engaged in the elections on both sides, really. I was there for a week, and there were two big demonstrations, one pro-European and one for the ruling party. There was also a big difference between the two rallies. On the Sunday before the election, the pro-European demonstration was around the Liberty Square. And I didn't seek it out very much because I was a bit concerned about how it might turn out. It was quite calm. But it differed quite a lot from the ruling party rally on Wednesday, I believe, because the traffic was chaotic. It was quite insane, because you could really tell that the ruling party drove in a lot of people from the districts. So the entire city was crowded with buses, and it felt less organic in a way. But you could tell that there was support for both sides. We in all of the polling stations that we attended, the counting, Georgian Dream was the largest party.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for this summary and giving us a picture of how the elections were in Georgia. But what from these observations that you had, what do you find most concerning that you found, as you also had some experience with observing other elections? What was maybe a surprising element for you?
I think the most concerning part was obviously where observers and opposition candidates were attacked. There was physical violence that we observed, which for me is quite concerning. At some point, I was quite concerned about our team. Mm-hmm. But also the widespread intimidation of voters that is also difficult to observe while in a polling station. Because for the most part, the procedures were followed as we could tell, but we don't know what has happened beforehand. And and as well the identification of voters, because all voters were inked or were sprayed with a transparent fluid. And this was quite easy to wipe off or remove. Everyone was checked on their thumbs with UV lights while entering a polling station, but our observers tested this, and it was quite difficult to see if the ink was really there or not. And so if there has been carousel voting, we can't, it was difficult to observe it because the inking wasn't very easy to see if it was working properly.
So many questions.
Many questions.
Yeah. Thank you, Neo. We're also very lucky to have with us Giorgi Cheishvili from Tbilisi, who is joining us digitally. Giorgi is an anthropologist currently associated with Tbilisi State University. And Giorgi, I know that this has been very intense couple of last weeks, both with increasingly intense and polarizing election rhetoric, the disturbing concerns about the election day proceedings, results, new protests and mobilizations. But can you tell us, please, about the pre-election atmosphere in the country, and how did you experience the election day as a voter? And what have been reactions to the election results? And what is kind of the post-election atmosphere and mood in general in the country?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Elina, and good morning, everyone. I really appreciate the attention you're giving to the situation in Georgia. I will start with a little bit of the background for these elections to be understandable a little bit. So one of the interesting things, which might sound a little bit like an oxymoron, is that Georgians have never really voted for an entire European party. Until now, the Georgian Dream party, who has ruled the country for 12 years, has always presented itself as a very pro-European, pro-Western government. And for these 12 years, they were actually delivering on it. For example, the association agreement with the European Union, and I remind you, this is the agreement that not signing of which basically led to Euromaidan in Ukraine. The Georgian government just signed it without any problem. They actually reached the agreement with the European Union about visa-free travel of Georgian citizens. They have sent the biggest national contingent to Afghanistan under NATO. So they really portrayed themselves as a very pro-European country. But things drastically, pro-European party. But things drastically changed on the 25th of February, the day after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, when the prime minister said that Georgians would not, or Georgia as a country would not join the sanctions against Russia. And considering the anti-Russian sentiments in the Georgian public, this was kind of surprising, but also this was a first hint of clear reality-related shift of geopolitical vectors. Another one that was particularly clear in terms of geopolitical vectors was when Moldova and Ukraine applied for EU membership, but Georgian government refused to do so and said that they would rather do it in 2024 because that's how they had planned it. This caused massive demonstrations, and in the end, they did have to apply. But it seems they started sabotaging this application themselves. So they did present themselves as a pro-European government, but they did everything so that it would be impossible for the EU to further the negotiations about Georgian succession into the Union and so on. And this was done by this cascade of laws and also new narratives that they came up with. Of course, the first, like one of the laws they passed is the genre of the classic that we have also seen in Orban's Hungary and so on, which is against the LGBT, so-called LGBT propaganda. But the most controversial one was the law on foreign agents, as Elina already mentioned, which caused massive demonstrations in the city. But the government, for 2 months, hundreds and thousands of people were participating. but they still passed it, the government did. And what was problematic with this law is that for the first time in the history of independent Georgia, the West was portrayed through this law as an enemy that the country had to defend itself from. But for the Georgian Dream government, this was basically part of the new narrative that they wanted to implement, on which the election campaign was also built. And this was this new kind of conspiracy theory that they launched, but talked about it very seriously and actively about the Global War Party, which they explained that this is an organization that we don't necessarily know who the members of this organization are, but they have huge influence on Western politics and global order, and they manipulate with Ukrainian politicians, EU, American politicians, but also every politician in Georgia other than the Georgian Dream Party. So through this new narrative, they managed to kind of be anti-EU without being anti-EU, because most of its supporters were pro-EU. A lot of people who vote for them still believe that they're taking the country towards the EU integration. So they led a very aggressive election campaign to move to the pre-election situation. And this was entirely built on this narrative, war versus peace. So they argued that Ukraine, the West, and Georgian politicians want to open a second front with Russia and involve Georgia in a war. So if we could show the pictures that I have sent for illustration. So they basically showed the picture of all the party leaders, Georgian party leaders who are on leashes, and the leash is held by supposedly the Global War Party. It says in Georgian, no to war, no to agents. So they are portrayed as foreign agents. Next, please. And then they also portrayed these very immoral pictures. If we could see the next picture of the juxtaposition of the war-torn Ukraine next to supposedly flourishing Georgia. And we have one more example of this, and we can stop sharing. So, and also the pro-government media called the oppositional demonstrations pride parades and trying to stigmatize thousands of participants as basically members of the LGBT community. Thank you. We can probably stop sharing this. So this is the very polarized atmosphere in which the elections took place. And despite the tremendous resources that the Georgian Dream Party had and the administrative resources that they illegally basically used, there was still a huge anti-government sentiments in public. And the pre-election period was tense. And besides the use of administrative resources, the Central Election Committee, for example, refused to open polling stations in most of cities abroad where Georgians lived. And for example, investigative journalists showed how bosses at government organizations demanded their ID cards from employees, as was already mentioned by Neil. However, nobody quite understood what they were going to do with these ID cards. And despite all these, a lot of people and also political parties were very optimistic because according to independent surveys, the Georgian Dream Party had 35 to 42% of votes, which would mean the victory of the opposition and the possibility of forming a coalition government. The day of the election saw a huge mobilization of voters throughout the country. People on Facebook groups were offering each other cars to transport each other from Tbilisi to regions where they were registered so that they would vote. This would be 500 kilometers away. In the US and Western Europe, people flew to polling stations. For example, in the whole of the US, there were 2 polling stations in San Francisco and New York. So people had to fly from the rest of the country to go there, and they did. So because of this massive mobilization, the oppositional parties, but also voters, were quite optimistic. And at the end of the election day, the exit polls also showed a victory of the opposition. So it became a big surprise for the opposition and its supporters when the Central Election Committee announced a 53% victory of the ruling Georgian Dream Party. So while the opposition and its supporters believed that the elections were entirely rigged, and there was a huge demonstration in Tbilisi last night, Orban has already arrived in Tbilisi to celebrate Georgian Dream's victory. Russia's former president Medvedev has already called on the Georgian government to impeach the country's pro-European president Salome Zurabishvili and arrest her. And Russian ideologist Dugin, who's quite popular, he has called on the Georgian government to join the new BRICS organization, which is, quite scary for a lot of people here. To just finish with the situation as we have now, none of the Western leaders have congratulated the Georgian Dream. Sweden last night announced that they would cut all the official ties with Georgia. And many other countries, including the Baltic countries, Canada, the US, are calling on the Georgian government to, or they actually use the term Georgian leadership to start the negotiation, to start the investigation. And probably other countries will follow soon. As Elina mentioned, there were demonstrations last night, which will probably continue for many months to follow, but nobody knows how the results of these will. So basically, this is where we are now. I'll be happy to discuss the mechanism of the rigging the elections that NGOs and oppositional parties unveiled, and they are having these ongoing negotiations later in case there are any questions about it. But I will let other speakers take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Giorgi, for giving also the background of how we got to the place we are today. A lot of interesting things to unpack, and I hope we can return it in a couple of minutes. And I would also like to give word to our other speakers. Already mentioned here when talking about elections, one of the concerns is how the state institutions themselves have been implicit in the irregularities that have taken place. So we have also Karl Marquardt, yeah, with us today, who is a professor in comparative politics here at the University of Bergen, and who has worked extensively on a region of Eastern Europe, Caucasus, also Russia. And we are also involved in a bigger project looking at political institutions in the region and their performance. So, Karl, what can you tell us about the state of democracy in Georgia, the democratic backsliding, and the political institutions as such today in Georgia?
Hopefully a decent amount. Basically what I'm going to be doing today is taking a little bit of a step backwards. So talking very generally about trends in Georgia and also elsewhere around the world in terms of democracy. And I think I have some slides that will help illustrate this point. Sort of the key thing to note here is that what I'm going to be talking about mainly is data from this project that Elina alluded to, namely the Varieties of Democracy project, which basically uses expert coders or country experts to measure different aspects of democracy around the world and across time. And one of the key things that we do with these data, so I'm a project manager at the VDEM Institute also, is we aggregate these different low-level institutions upward to create overall measures of democracy. And as the name of the group, Varieties of Democracy, indicates, there are multiple different types of democracy that we're interested in studying. And the one that I'm going to be focusing on today is the form of democracy that we refer to as liberal democracy. And what liberal democracy is what most people mean when they say democracy. So it incorporates things related to electoral democracy, but also, so electoral democracy being the sort of institutions and conceptual and cultural and other sort of infrastructure for having free and fair elections in a country. And then liberal democracy goes a little bit further to also include things related to basically how well the state is able to protect the individuals within a country from encroachment on their liberties by the government. So things like civil liberties, things like checks and balances for the government. And here what we have is a sort of global picture of the state of democracy around the world. And those of you watching at home can probably zoom in to get a better picture of Georgia. But here, this is basically showing the level of democracy, liberal democracy around the world in 2023, which is the most recent year for which we have data. Purple means more liberal democracy, red means less liberal democracy. And don't worry, I will show you a more direct picture of Georgia in a second. But the key takeaway here is that if you can see Georgia, it's neither red nor purple, it's somewhere in between, which means that it's sort of at an intermediate level of liberal democracy in 2023, which is actually in line with a lot of other sort of rating organizations for how they do that. The other sort of key takeaway here is that you'll notice that it's surrounded by a sea of red. So Russia in particular is dark red, indicating that it's a very not liberal democratic country. You'll also notice that most EU members and Norway are dark purple, indicating that they're very liberal democratic. So the other cool thing about the VDEM data is that you can actually use it to track changes across time, both within countries and across countries. And so what I'm showing you here is a measure of liberal democracy across time, or the measure of liberal democracy I mentioned earlier across time from 1994 to 2023. And I'm showing you trends across 5 different countries. And as before, higher scores indicate more liberal democracy, lower scores mean less liberal democracy. And each of the different colors represents a different country. And the little shaded area around these different lines represents our statistical uncertainty. So how confident are we about our rating of democracy in a given country? So the line in purple at the very top is Norway. So Norway has had a very high level of stable liberal democracy. The green line that goes up and then goes down and then goes up again is Moldova, which is a fellow applicant for EU membership along with Georgia. The light blue line is Russia, which started off kind of liberal democratic and has become very not liberal democratic. The bottom dark blue line is Azerbaijan, Georgia's neighbor, which has since 1994 had very low levels of liberal democracy. So the one line that I have discussed is Georgia, which is the red line. And what you see is that liberal democracy in Georgia has generally increased for the last 30 years in kind of fits and spurts. So in 2004 with the revolution, there was a very big jump in the level of liberal democracy. And then again in 2012, 2013, with Georgian Dream coming to power, you have another increase in the level of liberal democracy, which peaked around 2016. However, and in line with what other speakers have mentioned, starting in 2016, there's been a gradual decline in the level of liberal democracy in Georgia up to 2023. And in fact, VDEM generally considers Georgia to be a democratic backslider and an autocratic near miss. So one where the next year, or actually the next year from 2023, which is this year, and specifically the next couple of weeks, are going to be really decisive in determining Georgia's path in the future. So why did the score of liberal democracy in Georgia decrease in the past couple of years? One thing is the measure of electoral democracy. So basically all the things that we've been discussing today about how free and fair elections are and what the sort of environment for free and fair elections are provided in the country. And here again, I'm just showing you trends across the same 5 countries, same colors, Norway at the top, Azerbaijan at the bottom, Moldova in green, kind of in the middle, and then Georgia in red. And what you see is that institutions of electoral democracy, so not liberal democracy writ large, but just those related to the ability to have free and fair elections that mean something, have also been decreasing in the last 5 years. So there's been a decrease in the ability of the Georgian state to have a free and fair election from sort of an institutional perspective. So the institutions that support free and fair elections have diminished in strength in the past 5 years. The other sort of more drastic change is in civil society, which I mentioned is an important aspect of liberal democracy. So again, here I'm showing you trends across the same 5 countries, again, Azerbaijan at the bottom, Norway at the top, of civil society. And this is the core civil society index from the Varieties of Democracy Institute, which basically measures how robust is a civil society in a country. So how much space is there for civil society to operate? How much is the government supporting the activities of civil society or repressing them? And Georgia, again, is in red. And the sort of key thing that's happened in Georgia, well, the big overall trend in Georgia is that Georgia has had comparatively a very high level of civil society, but between 2022 and 2023, there was a sharp decline. And this indicates that the government has been reducing the space for civil society organizations to operate in line with a lot of these issues that we were discussing earlier. So even though the foreign agent law was not passed until this year, the introduction of it and the concomitant reduction of the space for civil society to operate had a big influence on that. You also have the increased repression of LGBTQ actors in Georgia, which also reduced the space for civil society to act. So this is sort of flashing red sign about the future of Georgia in terms of how well the state is allowing civil society to operate. The final graphic that I want to show is one that gives a sort of important indicator for especially the next couple of years, which is a measure of pro-democratic mass mobilization. And basically what this is measuring is how frequently and how strongly do people in different countries engage in pro-democratic civil society activism, so mass mobilization in defense of democracy. And here purple is high and red is low. And you can have a low score because there's low mobilization for democracy, doesn't necessarily, but there could be low mobilization for democracy because there are no threats. So liberal mobilization for democracy really starts to kick in when there's a threat to democracy and civil society actors are opposed to it. And what we'll notice here is that Georgia is dark purple. So even though there has been increasing repression of civil society and decreased robustness of civil society, there's still a substantial number of people in Georgia in 2023 who are willing to get on the streets to mobilize in defense of democracy. And that's what we saw yesterday and potentially what we're going to be seeing in the future. So thank you.
Thank you, Kyle. So it's always good to end on a positive note that there is a potential for mobilization. And also, I think Georgia also has very much tradition for public protests and mobilization. So despite the concerning developments, there's still good to end on a positive note. We also have seen how these elections have been framed not only in terms of what is happening in Georgia, but very much around geopolitical realities and dynamics in the region. And Paulina, I'm going to you with this question. Paulina Salek-Lipcean, you're also from the comparative politics department at the University of Bergen and been researching a lot political regimes in wider Eastern Europe. So how do you see that these elections have been framed in Georgia as a choice between Europe and Russia? And what is your view on this kind of framing? And how do you see EU and Russia tensions or relationships playing out in Georgia? And what's at stake for Georgia and the wider region in this kind of geopolitical dynamic?
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here and to talk about Georgia. And I will be able to answer your question. I will build a little bit on what has been said before by Giorgi and Kyle. Also because I think that the most important thing in understanding, for instance, from the European perspective, what's at stake in Georgia, first of all, is this to set a context, to say that Georgians have been very pro-European. So the latest poll showed that the overall majority, like nearly 80% of Georgians, would support this pro-Western path. And also it is important to mention that, for instance, Georgia, this pro-European, pro-Western path is also entrenched in the Georgian constitution that was included in the constitution in 2018 while the Georgian Dream was in power. So as Giorgi mentioned, of course, this tension with Europe has been there in place only since few years. Mm-hmm. And actually if you look at this from the European perspective, like the first alarm bells arrived early in 2021 already, when the government refused like the second tranche of 150 million euros long-term loan to Georgia, and that was conditional on reform, like the justice reform, like legislative reform. And that was something about depoliticization of the justice sector, and that was something that was not very well taken by the Georgian government at the time. So that was the first alarm bell that arrived from Georgia to the European Union, that things may not necessarily go along this path as before. There was also another sign also in 2021, because also during the elections in 2020, there were some tensions and irregularities and some tensions between Georgian Dream and the opposition. So the EU was involved in some brokering, like the agreement between the incumbents and the opposition. But then in 2021, the Georgian Dream withdrew from this agreement. So that was another sign, the alarm bell, let's call it like this, for the EU, that things are not exactly going along the path that was established before. But nevertheless, like the EU, well, facing this conundrum, like how to deal with the backsliding, the democratic backsliding in Georgia, and at the same time not to alienate the Georgian government entirely, and also show support for the Georgian population that is so supportive for the EU, went ahead with the candidate perspective for Georgia. That was not immediately granted as for Ukraine and Moldova in 2022. It was done a little bit more gradually with some sort of pre-agreement called European Perspective that had like 12 points on which Georgian government would have to deliver in order to receive the candidates' perspective. And even if Georgian government did not deliver on all of those, eventually this candidate's status arrived in December 2023. But immediately after, as Giorgi also mentioned, the foreign law came in play, and also the LGBT, so-called LGBTQ, anti-LGBTQ propaganda law, which both the foreign law and the LGBTQ propaganda laws are clearly against the EU values and what the EU has to offer to Georgia. So, but nevertheless, also the answer of the EU was not very firm, especially after the protests when they were suppressed by the government, the anti-foreign law protest. So the EU answer was quite mild, I would say, at the beginning, and there was, well, the candidate's perspective was de facto frozen in June this year, but nevertheless, the sanctions or anything like more firm as a response it's not arrived as so far. Contrary to what the US actually did, then the US like targeted some EU officials that, I'm sorry, Georgian officials that were involved in passing the law and also in suppressing the protests. So the US response was much more harsh, I would say. There were also like the US suspended some bilateral cooperation and some funding to Georgia as well. Whereas on the EU side, there's been a lot of talk, but not like very firm measures taken as yet. Now we will see what will happen. I think that the EU's response is very much contingent on what will actually happen in Georgia itself. So we will see how the protest evolve, and what will be also the answer from the Georgian Dream itself to the potential protests from the civil society side, but also from the opposition side. And of course, as Giorgi mentioned, that there is no official recognition from the EU of the elections. There is like the calls to solve all the to explain and investigate all the irregularities. And then we will see. We might not expect a very uniform answer from the European Union. We will see how it goes, of course, because as also Giorgi mentioned earlier, we have countries like Hungary, Viktor Orban's, like Orban's is already there. But then on the other side, we have countries like the Baltics, Poland, and Sweden, who are much more firm in their response. So I think that what we can expect from the EU now, it's by the end of the October, Commission needs to release the enlargement report. So most probably, of course, Georgia will not be invited to progress towards the candidate to open the accession. But what we can actually expect, I think that, yes, it very much depends on the situation in Georgia itself. The important thing to mention here is also that Georgia is and has been a very important country for the EU itself. It's in the region, it's like a transportation hub and so on. It's also like losing Georgia means losing somehow the impact in the region and giving a lot of leverage to Russia. As it has been mentioned before, Georgia hasn't joined the sanctions yet, but then the situation can also be more favorable to Russia if Georgia is entirely subjugated to Russia. But it also means losing most probably Armenia in the region, because then there is no possibility for the EU to be more present in the region. And it also has, I mean, the Georgian elections are followed the elections in Moldova that took place a week before. Those were presidential elections, and at the same time, a referendum was held whether to include in the constitution this pro-European, pro-Western, like Euro-Atlantic path, as the Georgian constitution has. And as for the referendum, the victory was like very razor thin, I would say. So this is also another important alarm bell for the EU to kind of reconsider how to approach those countries in the region, and also how to counter the Russian influence in the region.
Thank you, Paulina. I think it's also interesting to listen how not only what's at stake for Georgia, but also for Europe or EU project as such, and what kind of significance the Georgia and Caucasus play in the region in terms of different influences. Thank you all for very insightful comments, both from election day observations, democratic institutions, rather geopolitics, and the background of Georgia. I open the floor to any questions the audience might have. I think we also have digital audience, so you can post your questions online. I have a lot of questions, but I wanted to give a chance to you. So I just open the floor. So, okay, I'll save my questions for later, as I see we have 4 questions. I suggest we just gather 4 questions now, and then we take a round, and we see where we get it. So first, here in front, Tuna.
Yeah. Thank you. Would we press anything? No. So I've seen comments by observers that the reaction from the EU to these elections have been measured. And I also seen comments saying that the opposition seemed deflated. So my question is, will the coalition hold? So maybe this is to Giorgi. Since because of this reaction that could have been stronger. And then I have one may add to the election observer. You were in Tbilisi, right? So I was just also wondering about the difference between Tbilisi and not Tbilisi, you know, the urban Tbilisi versus outlying areas or the rural areas in terms of how the election went, the polling stations. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuna. Other questions? I think there are, yeah. Okay, so you who has the microphone now, and then the gentleman in the back, and then a woman in the white back, and then you in front in blue. Okay, now we have a question with that, please.
Yeah, I was wondering about if there was any use of Georgian recent past in the election campaign. I read a book about Vladimir Putin by Marsha Gasson, who said that he used nostalgia for the Soviet Union as part of his campaign and policy. And I was wondering if Georgian Dream perhaps did do something similar for this election about nostalgia for the recent past for Georgia.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back.
Thank you for very engaging presentations. I have a question for Giorgi mostly, I guess, because he wanted to unpack the rigging mechanism. Giorgi, can you say whether the opposition in Georgia has some tools to trace back until the level of the polling station, the way how they count this magnitude of rigging of vote falsification? Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your discussion. My question is mostly to Georgi as a person who's Georgian. And I am from Ukraine, and I'm very curious about, first of all, if you can answer, because this is the scenario that Ukraine is considering and is afraid of, because in our media circles, it is not quite clear how after the invasion of Georgia that Russia had, there are still quite strong, at least in the political circles, pro-Russian sentiments, and what is the main cause of that? If you could explain that, that would be amazing. And my second question is that you showed the pictures comparing Ukraine in rebels and prosperous Georgia, and I see again in our media a lot of support for Georgian protests and encouragement to, start something similar to our Euromaidan. And what I wanted to ask, if public opinion on that is mostly supportive of what we show, if people are actually willing to, start the revolution and be very defined in pro-European future, or is the fear of consequences that Ukraine had after Euromaidan stronger than the pro-European vector that youth mostly, I think, would support? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. And final question here in the front.
Yes, thank you. So it's going to be heavy on Georgi today. I have a question as well. You went in on how the ruling party has advocated for a anti-European stance while still having the support of a mainly pro-European base. How are they able to balance these, this seeming impossibility? If you could go a bit more in depth on that.
Thank you. I think then we will allow people to answer, and if we have more time, then we can take another round. Georgi, while you're noting down some of the answers, maybe we can take around here in Bergen. Noel, a question about elections?
Yes, about if there are differences between Tbilisi and the regions. From EDA, we only have data from Tbilisi, but from what we have seen on Twitter, in the media, but also about the procedures. So a big thing about these elections was that they introduced electronic systems for most of the polling stations. 90% of voters, and I believe 70% of polling stations were now electronic, which meant that identification of voters went through a screen, and also the counting of votes was done by an electronic counter, as well as manually. In Tbilisi, I believe all the polling stations were electronic, but that the old method was kept in some of the regions. We saw footage of ballot stuffing in some of the stations where the old method was kept. Thugs from different unknown groups came into polling stations and stuffed a lot of ballots into the ballot box. This caused a lot of outrage. And the CEC, the Central Election Commission, started an investigation. I do not know if this has been widespread in other parts of Georgia. We don't have data to back this up ourselves. But I would also be inclined to believe that also the support of different parties probably varies from the urban areas to the rural areas in Georgia.
I also just wanted to follow up, as you mentioned, the buses during a pro-government rally.
Yes.
So do you know if people would be coming in from outside Tbilisi in these buses, or was it like within Tbilisi people were being shuffled around? Because that also could then have an interesting indication of this rural urban.
Absolutely. So our impression was that these people were transported from the regions, yes.
Yeah.
Mostly. And yeah, the city was crowded. The traffic was absolutely chaotic for the whole day, really. There's also this law in Georgia that public servants are not allowed to participate in political protests, I believe, during working hours. The protest started at 7, but many people came from towns many hours away. People believe that many were public servants and thus leaving their workplace during working hours. I can't confirm this firsthand, but this might be an indicator of also how public servants, a sector which has increased a lot in Georgia the past years, how public servants are intimidated and affected by the ruling party.
Yeah, thank you. Would you like to comment on any of the questions? Anything to add?
I think other people on the panel are more qualified to talk about a lot of these things.
Georgi, you have a long list of questions. The floor is yours.
Thank you, and thanks for the questions. The first question about whether the coalition will hold or not is a very important one, because it also says something about the pre-election agreement that was there. So no, they won't, but they also haven't promised that they would. This is a very eclectic mix of parties, ideologically and otherwise, who the only glue that is that holds them together is getting rid of the current government. But also the president, Salome Zurabishvili, came up with this charter that basically most political parties signed, which said that whatever coalition would win this government would stay in power for 1 year only. The government would be entirely technical, so it wouldn't be represented by members of political parties, but mostly scholars and so on. So within this 1 year, they would implement a lot of reforms, especially concerning the elections and also getting rid of these anti-liberal legislations. And after that, there would be free elections in 1 year. So that was the promise, because they could not really promise that all these parties would peacefully rule for 1 year. Yeah, I hope I answered that question. About nostalgia for Soviet Union, if government pursued this in their election campaign, absolutely not. This is not something, first of all, even the Georgian Dream Party promised, their slogan was, to Europe with dignity and peace. They were, in the Georgian context, it wouldn't be very profitable for any country to pursue that kind of policy that would be based on, this post-Soviet nostalgia. Quite the opposite. Everybody is claiming to be pro-European. And the rigging mechanism, I think Neil talked quite informatively about this. But I think one of the things that is becoming clear these days, because all the NGOs are saying that they are working 24/7 to unveil this whole mechanism, is that it was the first year when this whole electronic digital election was introduced. And the Georgian Dream government almost made all the parties thank them for this. And they kind of guaranteed that this would provide a very safe and safe way to vote for the population. However, what they actually did with this is that the observers, the Georgian observers, for example, who have a very long experience of observing elections, and they know exactly how these falsification mechanisms work. In this case, because the election was done differently, they had no idea what to look for. What seems to be the case now, as indicated a little bit, is that the machine that was supposed to register the voters, I already mentioned that a lot of ID cards were taken in advance. But apparently these ID cards were given back to the people, but they were doubled or tripled in different polling stations. And then they had these ID numbers of people whose ID cards were basically registered throughout the country. So the non-governmental organizations estimate that around 300,000 votes were gained by the government like this. In addition to all these more traditional ways of falsifying the elections, such as the so-called carousel that you mentioned already. And I think, and there are also on the internet, lots of videos how people just appear, they show up at the polling station and they are told that they have already voted when in fact they have not. So I think very soon we will know more. And I think that is the expectation from the West, to have something more substantial than just a feeling that something is wrong. Because according to the results now, every second Georgian voted for Georgian Dream Party, which kind of everybody senses that is not correct. But I think for the West and especially the EU to react, something more substantial is needed, and the NGOs are working on this. Yeah, and I will try to address the next questions about pro-Russian sentiments. I would say it does not exist. There is no way. There are pro-Russian actions done from the government, but there is no pro-Russian sentiments that exists in the public. So every time the government does something that is conceived of by many as pro-Russian, they have to explain it with something else, like the narrative about global war party and so on. And also they, the oppositional journalists often go to the government members and ask them to confirm that Russia is an occupier, and they actually have to do so. So I would not say that there are pro-Russian sentiments in Georgian public, if any. This is usually sold as pro-Georgian instead of pro-Russian, so on. And when it comes to Euromaidan, I think or something, a similar scenario in the context of Georgia, I think the Georgian Dream government has done a lot for the last 1 year to scare people off. The word Maidan is something that even if people think that that is something we need, people will not openly talk about it because the government will start using it against them and against the whole movement. But before the elections and after the elections, everybody was expected that there would be a follow-up demonstrations. And the only reason why the spring demonstrations that lasted 2 months, the only reasons they were stopped is because the elections were coming, otherwise they would escalate further. So I think a lot of people are hoping for a positive outcome from public protests and street protests, but they would not necessarily call it or term it as Euromaidan. And very often you would find Ukrainian flags and so on at these demonstrations. So these are very much seen as by Georgians as this one continuous process that is happening in Russia and by Russia in Ukraine and in Georgia, but in different ways. Thank you. I think
Yeah, thank you for those insightful comments. Unfortunately, as always, we have run out of time. So I have 2 pages of questions, but we'll save it for the next conversation and discussion. Thank you all for this talk, for giving us a picture of election day, the geopolitical involvement of EU and what's at stake on democratic situation in Georgia. And Giorgi, best of luck. And for sharing your insights from the ground. I'm sure we all will be closely following developments in Georgia and wish to see fair, just, and democratic Georgia to develop further. So thank you all for joining the talk and have a lovely day.
Thank you very much.